Good morning. Call this meeting to order. Apologies to the witnesses for the delay in starting. We had a vote, as you all know, and this is the time of the year when there are many of them and they're unpredictable and we just have to go with the flow. But we're ready to start now. Welcome to meeting number 21 of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Public Safety and National Security. We will start by acknowledging that we are meeting on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin people. Today's meeting is taking place in a hybrid format pursuant to the House Order of November 25th, 2021. Members are attending in person in the room and remotely using the Zoom application. Members and witnesses participating virtually may speak in the official language of your choice, and you will see at the bottom of your screen to choose either Floor, English, or French. Pursuant to Standing Order 108, Bracket 2, and the motions adopted by the committee on Thursday, March 3rd, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of the assessment of Canada's security posture in relation to Russia. With us today, not by video conference, but I can see in person as an individual, Dr. Charles Burton, Senior Fellow, Centre for Advancing Canada's Interests Abroad at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. Jennifer Quaid, who I believe is virtual, Executive Director of the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange. And Michael Doucette, who is with us personally, from Optiv Canada Federal, the Executive Director, Office of the Chief Information Security Officer. There will be up to 5 minutes for each of our guests to give us an introductory comment. And I will now invite Dr. Burton to take the floor for up to 5 minutes. Just so everybody knows, this is the 30-second warning. I am really strict. And when we get to the end of time allotment, either in opening statements or in rounds of questioning, I'll give you the 30-second warning, and then that, I'm afraid, is all the warning you will get. So, Dr. Burton, the floor is yours, sir, and welcome.
Thank you, Chair. The threat posed by Russia to Canada's public security and public safety and national security has increased significantly since the Western democracies responded to Russia's invasion of Ukraine with measures designed to cripple Russia's economy and with weapon support for the Ukrainian resistance. Whatever the outcome of the suffering in Ukraine, Russia will remain shunned by the West, blocked from financial transactions and trade with lucrative European markets. Putin, I think it's fair to say, is seethingly angry, tormented and resentful, and with dangerous capabilities to lash out at Canada in response. He is likely to make common cause with China, which will magnify the threat to us. Canada is inadequately prepared for the range of threats posed by Russia, including threats to Canada's critical infrastructure, espionage, and sabotage. We are less prepared than our allies. A considerable concern in this regard is whether the RCMP, CSIS, and the CSE have been sufficiently accountable to the public safety and national security concerns of Parliament as represented by this Commons Committee. We know that the RCMP, CSIS, and CSE and DND gather a lot of information on Russian malign activities, but when Parliament asks for briefing to inform the parliamentary development of legislation to protect public safety and national security, those agencies too often stonewall you, suggesting that the information is too sensitive or that disclosing it would reveal operational details which would be helpful to our enemies. It would be reasonable to assume that, the Five Eyes, including Canada, were aware of Mr. Putin's megalomaniac ambitions regarding Ukraine. Nothing has changed in Russia. It's simply our perception of it has become heightened. And they know what he has in store for future invasions and what he has in store for threats to Canada. But how can Canada prepare if the RCMP, CSIS, and CSE will not hand over their intelligence assessments on what we should prepare for? Too often, Canadian police and security agencies see their primary function is to simply curate information which they can trade with the counterpart agencies. Again, this issue is more pronounced in Canada than in our allies. For example, how badly does Canada need a Foreign Agents Registry Act or something like the Australian Foreign Influence Transparency Scheme Act as a national security measure? I judge this is very urgent for Canada, especially now. But CSIS would know better which Canadians influential in Canada's policy process have received benefits from a foreign state that put them in a conflict of interest that threatens Canadian security and sovereignty. How many of these are there? How high does it go? If CSIS has this data, they should give it to you. And what about RCMP's Cameron Ortiz? What should we be learning from his arrest? What about the Winnipeg Labs matter? Was there a failing in protection of Canadian national security that should be addressed by Parliament? Then there is the Quentin Huang matter. Why is it that, unlike our allies, Canada does not successfully prosecute and send to prison people who transfer military technologies from Canada to agents of a foreign state? Let me add just one last point. As the Common Special Committee on Canada-China Relations has examined, the Chinese language media in Canada is strongly dominated by elements that support the Chinese Communist Party's agenda in Canada. Since the outbreak of hostilities in Ukraine, Chinese domestic media and its proxies in Canada have been repeating the Russian conspiracy theories and associated disinformation day after day, week after week, more or less word for word. This Russian disinformation has the effect of discrediting the integrity of Canadian democratic and judicial institutions and debasing the loyalty to Canada of a significant fraction of Chinese Canadians. So Canada needs to take all of this much more seriously, in my view, and allocate the resources and the restructuring of our public safety and national security agencies to address it much more effectively than we have up to now. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Ms. Quaid to give us up to 5 minutes of an opening comment. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Jennifer Quaid, and I'm the Executive Director of the Canadian Cyber Threat Exchange, the CCTX. The CCTX is a pan-Canadian, member-based, not-for-profit organization focused on enabling Canadian companies to build cyber resilience through collaboration. We represent 170 members across 15 sectors. We're founded by some of Canada's largest companies, but our mission is to enable organizations of all sizes to reduce financial and operational risk through access to relevant and timely threat intelligence. Members choose to participate because they recognize that being aware of the cyber threat environment and its ever-changing landscape is the first step to ensuring cyber resilience of their organizations. As Canada's Minister of National Defence recently said, cybersecurity is one of the most serious economic and national security challenges we face. As you know, cyber threats are becoming more sophisticated and are increasingly pervasive, driven by the growth and global adoption of innovative technologies. Cybercrime pays. Who does it pay? Cyber threat actors can be roughly grouped into a couple of categories. Nation states who are conducting espionage and statecraft through the internet. Criminals who engage in cybercrime for financial gain. It's this criminal element that has commercialized cybercrime. It's now an industry unto itself. It's an industry where the barriers to entry are lower than ever. Technical expertise is no longer a requirement. Cryptocurrency makes collecting your fee easier, and the chances of getting caught are low. Several countries allow cybercriminal groups to operate within their borders. But we also have hacktivists, cyber attackers designed to target social injustice and the ever-present insider threat. The ongoing geopolitical tension in Russia and Ukraine has created an opportunity for an increase in hacktivism and criminal activity. The threat actors are targeting critical infrastructure on both sides, taking down banking websites and disrupting government service. The Conti criminal organization are acting in support of Russia. Anonymous claims to be waging a cyber war on Putin. And Network Battalion 65 stole and used Conti's code to lock up files inside government-connected Russian companies. Canadian organizations have been following events unfolding in Ukraine and are operating under a heightened sense of alert. CCTX members, in collaboration with the Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, are working to ensure that Canadian businesses can better defend themselves from these attackers. This is a good example of public-private partnership in action. Through the CCTX, the Cyber Centre has the opportunity to disseminate information to businesses of all sizes in all sectors. We can then enable our members to collaborate, to leverage and use that information in a meaningful way. But collaboration is more than sharing threat information. It's professionals sharing best practices, working together on cyber problems that are impossible to undertake within a single organization or sector. It's engaging with others to improve your cyber resilience, the resilience of your supply chain, your customers, and the Canadian economy. It's an effective way to expand your team's capacity, which is increasingly important in an economy where there are 25,000 open positions. And according to CIRA, 25% of organizations have reported a data breach, and the attacks aren't stopping. What more can be done? The government can make sharing easier for many organizations by the simple act of creating safe harbor legislation, laws designed to encourage businesses and organizations to voluntarily share information by protecting them from legal repercussions, sharing beyond statutory requirements. You can also enable more companies to join a collaboration organization by making membership eligible as an ITB. Anything to encourage sharing information. Collaborating on cyber threats, building our collective resilience. These are critical to prevent, detect, and contain cyber attacks in the private sector. Our success increases significantly when we work together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Michael Doucette, who will have the floor up to 5 minutes for an opening comment. Whenever you're ready, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. And good morning. I'm honored to be here this morning speaking on behalf of my organization, Optiv. Our level of preparedness to the wide range of threats posed by Russia deserves this dialogue, our collective engagement, and our commitment to focus on hardening our systems, preparedness, and response. Optiv is pleased to be part of this dialogue. As a practitioner who has contributed to national security in various roles in government for 30 years, and now with the Pure Play Cybersecurity Integrator for close to 4 years, I'm keenly interested in our approach to understanding and countering the cyber threats facing us from Russia and other nation-states who wish to do us harm. This threat knows no national, provincial, territorial, or municipal boundary. Cybersecurity is a team sport which requires mature governance, focused attention, measurement, and exercising. Continued vigilance must be the standard. A few words about Optiv. Optiv is a world-class leading cybersecurity integrator. We work alongside clients in public, private, and not-for-profit sectors to manage cyber risk and equip organizations with perspectives and programs to accelerate business or program progress. We cover the wide range of cyber products and services, including but not limited to threat intelligence, threat hunting, incident response, managed services, identity, and data management. In my role at Optiv as Executive Director of the Office of the Chief Information Security Officer, I have pan-Canadian responsibility to engage all sectors and verticals in understanding, quantifying, exercising, and enhancing their cyber posture. Typically, this is performed on a risk-based approach. What do I mean when I talk of a risk-based approach? Well, you begin by understanding your cyber program. You then measure your cyber program, and you identify gaps that must be closed to reduce risks to the organization. This is done on the backdrop of a changing environment requiring vigilance and constant improvement. In the world of cybersecurity, your job is never complete. Organizations cannot take a day off. Digital transformation and cybersecurity are fast-paced, mission-critical, and increasing in complexity. It is incumbent upon all stakeholders and citizens to positively impact our digital environment. Now let's move to the weighty question of our level of preparedness on the threats posed by Russia. with a focus on continuity of government and critical infrastructure. Of course, government is part of critical infrastructure, but I'll speak specifically to the federal government. At a high level, what is the threat posed by Russia? Let's take a look at the initial threat. Prior to the ground offensive, Optiv's Global Threat Intelligence Center widely distributed advisories summarizing cyber incidents related to ongoing tensions in the Ukraine, as well as previous cyber activity attributed to the Russian government in support of military operations in Eastern Europe. Cyber activity and Russian influence operations against Ukraine and NATO, supporting Russian military shaping operations, include denial of service attacks, psychological operations, and disinformation campaigns as pretexting for military operation. Now let's move on to the question of preparedness. How do we measure our level of preparedness? We strive for a horizontal approach to cyber when threats and needs vary by critical infrastructure vertical. Cyber programs should be right-sized to the organization. However, they can still be reported in a consistent manner. Every organization should know the health and status of their cyber program. And I can't put too fine of a point on that, every organization. You need to measure this. And then you need to determine the end state of your cyber program. And if there's a gap between those two, you need to endeavor to close that gap. Practically, what does this mean? It means assessing your cyber program, metrics, assessing gaps, developing a cybersecurity strategy. From the strategy, build programs and plans to address the gaps. You must evolve an incident response plan and business continuity plans to ensure continuity of operations. With this, you can support it by metrics and a dashboard. You need to exercise those plans to ensure that you are ready to respond to an incident. Then you need to continuously measure and improve the program. I'd be happy to provide the committee with concrete recommendations during our discussions. I will leave my opening comments at that, and I'm pleased to take questions during the further discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and you won't have long to wait for questions. I'm going to open the floor to questions right now. And leading us off, Ms. Dancho, you have a 6-minute block whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here. Mr. Burton, my first questions are for you. Concerning Russia and its relationship with China, in particular how it signed a security pact. They both signed a security pact together, largely viewed as against America and the West. And that was back in February. I'm just wondering if you could tell the committee, given your extensive experience and academic background with China, when we're looking at security of Canada, and we're talking about Russia specifically in this study, how do you view the security pact influencing how Canada should approach its own security?
Well, I think it is a cause of great concern. Essentially, you know, because of Mr. Putin's badly advised or probably not advised invasion of Ukraine, Russia will be considerably weakened both militarily because they're losing a lot of stuff. You know, they lost the Moskva in the Black Sea, and they're also going to have their economy crippled. This will force Russia to have to rely more on China for export of the commodities that sustain Russians' prosperity, you know, oil and minerals, and also to rely on China for bucking the sanctions that we've imposed. You know, China has facilitated North Korea in effectively avoiding the sanctions that we attempted to impose on that regime. So we'll be in a situation where China, I think, will certainly extract a price for this, which will be that they will expect Russia to collaborate with China in China's overall global agenda, and that could include seeking Russian military support for action taken against Taiwan in the future, and combining with Russia with regard to claims in the Arctic. You know, Russia, as you know, claims pretty much everything under the Canadian continental shelf, and China has the resources and ability to actually start to exploit those Arctic resources. China referring to itself recently as a near-Arctic state. I think it's about as near to the Arctic as Yemen, but in any event, you know, they want access to our northern resources for strategic purposes, ports and so on, and to our natural resources. and with the strategic positioning of Russia, if they go together, this is really very bad news for Canada. And, as I've argued elsewhere, unlike some of the other witnesses to this committee, I really feel that we need to start thinking about what sort of protection we can do for our northern regions. And it's not really about do we give 2% or less or more. It's really about how much is it going to cost to overcome decades of neglect of our Arctic, particularly as Russia and China combined together actually do start to pose an effective threat in the light of global warming, opening up those waters to navigation by Chinese vessels and Russian vessels of various kinds.
I appreciate that. And I wanted to ask you specifically as well about the Russian ambassador, or the Canadian ambassador in Russia, and the Russian ambassador here in Canada, which has been widely seen to has been spreading considerable misinformation in Canada. Now, the Liberal government right now is saying we can't expel the Russian ambassador from Canada because they'll do the same to our Canadian ambassador in Russia, and therefore we won't have eyes on the ground. Can you comment on that? Do you agree with the Liberals' position on this?
I wouldn't want to politicize it in terms of a political party, but I do think that if we do not make diplomats in Canada accountable for their activities which are not consistent with their diplomatic status, whether this is menacing and harassment of people in Canada or attempting to influence discourse in Canadian newspapers, particularly Chinese language media, by coercing advertisers and the persons who may have relatives back in China to not report on things or to report on them in a certain way. I think that those diplomats should be made accountable, and we should PNG them, declare them persona non grata, and bear the consequences of reciprocal expulsions. Our passive attitude towards this simply emboldens these regimes to do more, and I think we have to put a stop to it. And I anticipate that we'll see more of this in collaboration with our allies, particularly in Europe, in the months ahead.
Mr. Burton, my next question is for Ms. Quaid. Ms. Quaid, I'd like to get your perspective on sort of the weakest link in our cybersecurity in Canada. To my knowledge, our very large corporations have relatively strong cyber defense. But what about down the supply chain for some of our larger corporations? They rely on small and medium enterprises. Can you comment on where you think we need to bolster our cybersecurity defenses? Ms. Quaid, I think you're on mute. Thank you.
Thank you again for the question, Ms. Dancho. You're absolutely correct. The small and medium enterprises, which make up 98% of our economy, so in fact, they're not just the supply chain for the large corporations, but for the entire economy. They undoubtedly represent our weakest link, although I hate to use that term. And they represent that because, according to recent stats, 44% of them do not have any defenses in place against a possible cyber attack. Many of our smaller organizations they have concerns about they don't have the data, they don't feel that they're under attack, that they're a target for an attack. What they're not realizing is that data of any kind.
10 seconds, please.
So you're quite correct. 44% don't have any form of cyber defense, 60% have no insurance, and we need to do more.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Now I would like to invite Mr. Chang to take his 6-minute slot. Sir, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to thank the witnesses for your time today and in providing us your expertise. My question is for Mr. Doucette. From your perspective, what are some of the largest cybersecurity threats facing Canada's national security related to Russia, and what are some proactive steps that can be taken to avoid threats to Canada's national security and our critical infrastructure, and what should Canada be prepared and able to do in the event of a large-scale cybersecurity attack from Russia?
Thank you for your question. There are quite a few elements to that question. Number one, historically, or when I began my career in government, when we looked at these threats, we certainly looked to nation states, the Russian threat, and so on. And it was, handled in government, but it was not as pervasive to private sector. Today, that threat against Canadians is not only a national security concern for governments themselves, but also a national security concern for critical infrastructure. And we know most critical infrastructure is not owned by government. In a lot of cases, not necessarily regulated by government. The weakest link is sitting back and thinking you're okay by not having a program, by not measuring risk, whether you're small, medium, or large enterprise. I enjoyed Jennifer's comments on small and medium enterprise, but I'd also like to highlight that larger enterprise are potentially a more lucrative target for our attackers. Therefore, an advanced, persistent threat such as Russia or other state-sponsored is really, really tough. And we have to be 100% vigilant, not only internally to the organization, but across our suppliers when we're thinking of third-party threats as we're moving to different platforms and so on. Very, very important. Now, the $1 million or potentially $1 billion question is really what do we do about this? And I'd like to highlight some work that the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians put together and was tabled not very long ago. They had a framework and activities to defend systems and networks of government. And it was tabled in February, and it's an extensive report. It's worth reading. But it raises a couple of issues. And by the way, all of the recommendations were accepted, but it raises a couple of issues. One being, and this is a direct quote from the report, who is protected depends upon who you ask. We need to fix that, quite frankly. We need to fix that from both a responsibility and accountability perspective. But we also need to fix who do you ask, right? So that's really important to us. Another quote, threats posed by gaps is clear. We know we have gaps. This is not an effort to blame people, organizations for gaps, but we know we have them and we must be diligent in closing them. And we must be doing so in a programmatic way where we're hitting the high threat items. Cybersecurity, in my opinion, is not about dollars spent, because you can spend immeasurable amounts of money on this, there's no question. Cybersecurity is, once again, about team sport and spending your dollars in the right areas that are going to have the best effect on government systems or on critical infrastructure systems or on shared systems. Sir, does that help?
Thank you very much. Just to follow up to your answer, should there be regulation to ensure cybersecurity in Canada, like regulation in terms of government regulation for government, for private and public sector? Do you think there should be regulation? And how would you, in your opinion, how would you suggest we close these gaps that you're mentioning?
Okay. We can talk about the responsibility for regulation, and my preference is not to overly regulate. Once again, going to small and medium businesses, do they have the resources to respond to regulation? It is potentially more of a supportive environment, a communication environment. Whether you're a small or large organization or a homeowner with a network in your house, which we all do, there are immeasurable resources out there from Public Safety Canada, RCMP, and others to help us secure our systems. For small business, those could be very useful. To close the gaps, quite frankly, the gaps can be closed, but you need to understand them. You need to understand the gaps, you need to understand the impacts of those gaps, and you need to understand who wants to do you harm. And I'll give you the example. If you look at the financial sector versus the agricultural sector, there may be different threat actors in going after each one of those. Now, the disruptive actors that just want to create disruption, they'll go after anybody. But you need to identify your gaps and you need to close them. And the bad news there is, quite frankly, the world is changing around you. The environment is changing around you as you're doing all these things. So if I assess a system today or a system of systems, and I'm down a 2-year road to close those gaps, which is not unreasonable, what other gaps are presenting themselves during that period of time, and how can I be relevant and move the program forward at all times?
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Ms. Michaud, who will have a 6-minute block. It's very good to see you back. I hope you're feeling better, and welcome to your colleagues.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It is great to be back. I apologize, my voice is still a little hoarse. Thank you to our witnesses for being here. It's great to see you in person. Mr. Burton, you're clearly a specialist on China, and I will have some questions on that. In your statement, you said that Canada was inadequately prepared for security threats, for cybersecurity threats, that we were less prepared than our allies. In your view, why is that? What explains that, and what can we do to catch up? Is there perhaps a lack of investment over the years? Is it too late given what's happening in Ukraine? Do we still have time to prepare adequately, or is it too late, in your view?
Well, I think that, compared to other countries, Canada has been less proactive in prosecuting or outing elements that have engaged in cyber espionage. The United States has identified a number of agents of the Chinese People's Liberation Army who've been involved in this kind of activity. And we tend to be reluctant, I think, to engage with particularly the Chinese, because with regard to activities like cyber espionage or suppression of Chinese language media, or indeed harassment of people who might wish to speak out. They're harassed either by Chinese agents directly or through various kinds of harassment over the internet. And I think this has been because our government has given priority to the promotion of prosperity in our relations with China, and is prepared to tolerate these sorts of activities because the cost to Canadian business and Canadian prosperity would be high, because the Chinese government has made it clear that if Canada does crack down on these sorts of activities of agents of the Chinese state in Canada, or disruption of our cyber, we will lose business. You may recall the hack of the NRC aerospace data, or the earlier hack of the Treasury Board and other related government departments, which I believe, from what I've heard, are attributable to the Chinese state, but there have been no consequences for China from doing this sort of activity. So it really is a question of political will, and I think that it would be great if your committee could start to compare the policies of other like-minded countries, particularly the United States, the UK, and Australia, with regard to this sort of activity. I mean, our cyber situation is really so grave that arguably it looks like the Five Eyes is being reduced to Three Eyes. When you look at the Quad, it doesn't include Canada. It does include, when you look at the Australian, UK, US activity in Indo-Pacific, to the best of my knowledge, the United Kingdom is not an Asia-Pacific country, but Canada is. So why has the United States and Britain decided not to include us? The recent consultations between the United States and UK on Taiwan, along with Japan, why is Canada, which is, in part of our country is geographically closer to China than Australia, why are we being excluded? And I think it's because we have not been pulling our weight in terms of addressing threats to public safety and national security, and our allies just don't see us as reliable partners anymore, along with New Zealand, which is for different reasons. So I feel very sorry about this, but I do feel that it's not too late. Of course, this is the Parliament of Canada. We can turn this around.
Merci, très intéressant. Justement, vous mentionnez.
Thank you. You mentioned the United States, Australia, the United Kingdom. Are there best practices applied there at the moment that you could recommend? Practices that Canada could implement to protect essential infrastructure, to prevent cyber attacks? Are there practices that you're seeing applied by other countries that could be useful in Canada?
Yes. If you look at the United Kingdom, last year, UK expelled 3 spies posing as journalists working in the UK. They revealed that there was an agent of the Chinese state, Christine Lee, who was giving generous donations to certain politicians who then, one presumes in response, would be representing the interests of China over the interests of their own country. We've seen in the United States, much more concern about the leak of high-tech technologies that would facilitate dual-use military technologies or technologies that would facilitate cyber espionage out of universities. Canada has not responded to things like the Australian Strategic Policy Institute's report that revealed that there were researchers of the People's Liberation Army working in sensitive areas of high tech in Canadian universities. They had entered Canada under false pretenses by not revealing their status as military officers. It goes on. Why didn't we do more about the Michael Chan matter in Ontario? The CISA said that he had frequent contacts with the Chinese Consul General, but we don't know what they were talking about.
Thank you.
It's important for Parliament to know.
Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Mr. McGregor to begin his 6-minute slot. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you. I'll echo my colleagues. Thank you to our witnesses for appearing before our committee and helping us with the course of this study. Dr. Burton, I would like to start with you. So you had spoken in your opening remarks about the relationship between CSIS, the RCMP, and CSE, and also the fact that the Parliament of Canada sometimes doesn't have a very good analysis of what those individual national security agencies are up to. I want to put this in the context of the fact that the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, the act that authorized that committee, is due for a statutory review this year. And I think that review lends itself to our current study because, as you said, we are woefully unprepared to meet many of the security threats. In your view, do you have any recommendations do you have recommendations as to what you would like to see that review cover? Is the current model of parliamentary oversight working? What would you like to see done differently? Are there any models, say, in the United States Congress or in the UK Parliament that we should be looking at as examples?
The answer is, I think, yes, particularly Australia and UK and US, but also Scandinavian countries have a lot to teach us in terms of, drawing the appropriate line between not revealing information that would be threatening to Canada's national security, but, not that the security agencies not in effect protecting perhaps their own inadequacies in the performance of their duties as described in the mandates to the ministers that oversee them. So I think in Canada we do have far too much polite agreement with the security agencies that say we can't tell you this or that. I think that it's a cultural issue. They really, to some extent, frankly, I feel that they disdain parliamentary committees and do their best to tell you as little as possible for fear that if you find out something, it might reflect negatively on them or past assessments that may not have been accurate. So, I do think that there needs to be more trust of parliamentarians to maintain secrecy, and that we need to be looking at the kinds of parliamentary committees or congressional committees that exist in other countries and trying our best to see if we can make Canadian committees more able to inform decisions about what legislation needs to be made based on a full understanding of what's going on. I mean, I really don't think that in any other country the Cameron Ortiz matter would be suppressed for so long. Or that the Quentin Huang matter, that Mr. Huang, who is alleged to have transferred military technologies to the Chinese state.
Sorry, Dr. Burton, sorry to interrupt, but I've got a limited time, and I want to get to Ms. Quaid. Ms. Quaid, in your opening remarks, you made mention of the fact that cybercrimes pay and that cryptocurrency does allow for easy payment. I'm sure you're aware that cryptocurrency has been a hot topic in Canadian politics over the last number of weeks. We had Professor Robert Hubert appear before our committee, and he said that financial crimes in Canada are difficult to assess because there is a lack of transparency and visibility in financial transactions in Canada. In his view, more transparency is needed. I was wondering do you have any specific recommendations you would like to see this committee make, just in the context of that remark, but also in the context of cryptocurrency? Like, what does the federal government need to be doing more to assess the possible, or including more transparency and visibility?
I would suggest that we start with the safe harbor legislation. Make it easier for organizations that have been attacked through any of the methods to actually report not just that they were attacked, but to tell the world what happened. And that creates transparency on the threat and helps other organizations, echoing what Michael was saying, it's a team sport. So if we are telling each other what's happened and how people got into their systems, it will prevent further attacks. So that's, I think, the easiest thing to do is the safe harbor legislation. On the cryptocurrency side, you would have to really speak to the banks and to find out there is no transparency on cryptocurrency. That's the nature of it. So who's been paid what by whom when? It's very difficult to speak to.
And finally, to Mr. Doucette, you made mention of the fact that cybersecurity is not about dollars spent. It's very much a team sport, and there are resources. With the increase that was announced in Budget 2022 for CSE, it's a significant chunk of money. What recommendations would you like to see our committee make with how that money is being spent? Are you satisfied with where it's being allocated? Do you want to see any more specifics? Anything you can tell us, please?
Okay, thank you for the question. When you look at the amount of money that's been provided to CSE, I would look for specific outcomes in cybersecurity in Canada, specific outcomes in the field in which they play, which is just about everywhere here in Canada.
Sorry, sir, just 10 seconds, please.
And so I think we want to be very outcomes-based on the spend. Also, I think we want to be very careful to build our organization for today's and tomorrow's threats, not last year's threats.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Colleagues, we now move into the second round of questions. We'll have enough time for each party. So there'll be 4 slots, and we'll begin with Mr. Van Popta, sir. You have 5 minutes whenever you're ready.
Good. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, witnesses, for being with us here today and sharing your wisdom and knowledge. Dr. Burton, I'll start with you. You had mentioned in your testimony and in response to an earlier question that the RCMP, CSIS, and CSE, Canadian Security Establishment, have information, but they tend to stonewall us. And you say that if they don't provide us with the information, as parliamentarians, how can we prepare for threats? Now, we've been told in Parliament that this is why we have the NCCOP, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. And I wonder if you could comment on the efficacy of that committee.
Well, you know, I'm of the opinion that it would be better if these matters were addressed through a committee of Parliament. People with security clearances, perhaps some sessions given in camera, not publicly, but I would rather see it as part of the regular parliamentary process. This process, I'm not aware of any other country in the world that has anything comparable, and I am concerned about whether it will be as effective as committees of other parliaments in terms of ensuring that our public safety and national security agencies are being fully accountable to Parliament and are providing parliamentarians with the information they need to draft legislation and change legislation to better meet the threats. I mean, one example I would give is our legislation with regard to the transfer of classified technologies to agents of a foreign state. I have had the honor of working for the RCMP in preparing some cases on these. When the cases are sent to the Department of Justice, and two of them that I know about, they were not acted on because our legislation is too weak, and it was felt that those people who are alleged to have been traitors to our country by transferring classified technologies to agents of a foreign state will not be made accountable for it. Our legislation does not compare favorably to that of other nations who are successful in this. You know, the British and the Americans are doing dozens of cases a year. When was the last time you heard of anybody who had been prosecuted for this in Canada? To the best of my knowledge, never. You know, this is a problem, and it does mean that we are considered a sort of a good place for people that want to tap into our high tech through various, you know, legitimate or illegitimate means to come, and that it just shouldn't be the Canada that we are.
For that, Dr. Burton. And Mr. Doucette, I'm going to put the same question to you. See if you have a different perspective on the efficacy or the usefulness of NCCOP in replacement of other sorts of committees receiving reports.
Absolutely, and thank you. And I was afraid you were going to ask me that question. I may give a little bit of a different perspective on this, having spent most of my federal career within that community. I wouldn't, with all due respect, I wouldn't necessarily accuse the community of stonewalling. However, I would potentially accuse them of overclassifying information. And I think this comes down to the culture and the culture of those organizations. And when I joined CSE on April 2nd, 1988, you know, I wasn't allowed to tell my family how many people worked there. There were so many things that you just, you know, you were behind that iron curtain. And we had this, call it cloak of secrecy, call it need to know, call it what you want. So I think the community needs to mature on that front. And I think, you know, if we are going to really, really engage critical infrastructure players can get security clearances. We can provide them with classified information. The government can do that. That is available. We need to declassify when we need to declassify. Having valuable threat information but not being able to act on it is not a good place to be. So those are my thoughts on that. As it relates to the National Security Committee of Parliamentarians, I can tell you I personally did a happy dance when they were formed. And I thought that was a tremendous step forward. Good on us, good on Canada to do that. Does it require some tweaking as they mature? Potentially. But I think it is a very good construct for Parliament.
You have 10 seconds, sir. Back to the committee. Your generosity is warmly received. We'll move right to Ms. Nemoff. You will have 5 minutes whenever you're ready to go.
Chair, and thank you to all our witnesses. Dr. Burton, it's always lovely to see you, so thank you for being here today. You had mentioned in your testimony about the relationship between China and North Korea. The isolation of Russia is not going to end anytime soon, and I think you mentioned as well that Russia and China will become even closer, and Russia will become dependent on China. What recommendations would you have for the Canadian government to ensure that we're keeping our critical infrastructure safe as that relationship gets closer between Russia and China?
Yes, I think that we have done one good thing. I was very pleased about the government's budget with regard to critical minerals, because I think that, you know, as the situation develops and as I believe that Russia will move more into alliance with China, it will be challenging for us to engage in secondary sanctions against China if China does with Russia what it's been doing with North Korea, which is facilitating the breaking of the sanctions that we imposing on Russia to try and induce Russia to come into compliance with the norms of the international rules-based order. You know, it's just it will be harder, and I think certainly if the world is going to split into two camps of the autocracies and the countries that Russia and China are able to bring into alliance in various ways. You know, China has quite a successful ability to rally support in the UN from nations that have received benefits under their Belt and Road Infrastructure Program. If we're going to be in that kind of a situation, it's important that we ensure our supply chains as a matter of national security, so that we cannot be subject to coercion by countries who say, well, you know, we will give you the element that you need, but if you're not nice to us in terms of complying with our political agenda in your country, then we'll cut you off. And you know, we saw that with the Chinese sanctions against canola seeds and meat at the time of the fiasco with regard to Meng Wanzhou and the completely unjustified and brutal incarceration of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor. So I do think that we have to look at this situation seriously, and that you know, we have to look at the CSIS assessments, which are critical for you to understand what Canada has to do. And it's not going to be without cost. And there's no point our pretending that this is not happening, because it is. And we have to make the hard choices necessary to protect our nation and other nations of our like-minded allies as a consequence.
Thank you, Dr. Burton. Mr. Doucette and Ms. Quaid, the U.S. is looking at mandatory reporting for attacks on critical infrastructure sectors, and I'm wondering whether or not you think that Canada should look at that. And before you answer, Mr. Doucette, you said you had a number of recommendations for the committee that you hoped you would get out in testimony. If you can provide those in writing, if you don't provide them during your testimony, that would be great. So maybe, Mr. Doucette, we could start with you.
Sure. I would certainly support mandatory reporting for select critical infrastructure players. And what I mean by that is, when you look at the 10 sectors within critical infrastructure, they're very, very large, agriculture being one of them. Are we going to ask mandatory reporting from a dairy farmer with 60 head of cattle? So we need to approach that with caution. That being said, if we are moving to a regime of mandatory reporting, we need to absolutely ensure that that reporting is safeguarded, that the source of that reporting is safeguarded, that the after actions on that reporting is safeguarded, and so on and so forth, and that we find a way to share that knowledge nationally. Because the last thing we want to do is have organizations report on breaches and have that disseminated where we don't want it disseminated. That's very, you know, when you put all that in, aggregate that information together, that's a lot of information.
We have about 20 seconds left. I'm sorry, Ms. Quaid. Could you perhaps jump in there?
Absolutely. Mandatory reporting is a good concept. It certainly assists the government to understand the size of the threat. But if the information that we learn from that mandatory reporting is not disseminated to the greater economy to help them to defend against the same threat, then really we're just going to be seeing the same thing happen over and over again.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you. I now will invite Ms. Michaud to follow her line of questioning. She has 2.5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Doucet, I have a question for you. We know that cyber attacks have been increasing for some years now, and that rise might have been exacerbated or has been exacerbated by the conflict in Ukraine. That's what we see in the news. You mentioned recommendations that you might have for the government, not only to protect government institutions, but also to protect private companies that might have an impact in Canada. So what recommendations can we make to the government?
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for that question. The first recommendation would be to government as a player within critical infrastructure, to the government to get it right, to take the series of reports on this subject and to tiger team those reports and look at how we're going to better protect the government infrastructure. As I mentioned earlier, there was a report by the committee that was accepted very broadly. It covers 169 federal organizations. I think the first step would be to understand the threats that are prevalent in each one of those 169 organizations, to ensure that they are reporting on those threats, identify gaps, and identify how they're going to lower those gaps. I think it's very difficult to go out to providers of critical infrastructure and tell them what they must do if you're not doing it yourself. I think the funding, I think the teams, I think people are there to accomplish this. Teaming across government departments is not always easy. They come with different cultures. They have different mandates, but we really have to, I believe we have to ensure that we can do so. So number one would be for the government to get it right. Then, of course, we need to look at how the government is providing advice and guidance to critical infrastructure providers and others. I would really want to look at the number of organizations out there that are supporting cyber environments, such as CCTX and others, and how can we harmonize that level of support to Canadians and Canadian infrastructure. The reason I say that is there is a wealth of organizations.
10 seconds, please.
Some security officers are really looking at, who do I talk to amongst these wealth of organizations? Where will I get that valued information, and who can be that trusted partner? So those are some of the recommendations.
Thank you. Mr. McGregor, you will take us to the end of this panel. You have 2.5 minutes whenever you're ready, sir.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Doucette, I'd like to actually continue with you. You had made mention of agriculture. That's actually my other critic role. And I know the technological advances in agriculture, they are going ahead at breakneck speed. Many of the machines used in modern agriculture, precision agriculture, there's use of blockchain technology. The machines now have the ability to communicate with the parent company, and farmers have access to real-time data, not only on how their crops are growing, but also the correct applications of pesticides and fertilizers, and just really, I was wondering, just on continuing what you said to Madame Michaud, can you talk about maybe some of the vulnerabilities that exist in Canada's agricultural fields, and maybe if we have any recommendations that we can make with respect to that, because that is a massive part of our economy, and we have big plans to grow it, and we are a major agricultural player on the world stage.
Absolutely, and thank you for that question. Having a son in Saskatchewan, I'm really, I really light up to the agricultural sector, because you don't, when you drive around rural Saskatchewan, it's evident, and it's evident when you're looking at modern day farming. I would say that modern day agriculture, on the scale that Canada is doing it, obviously, you have a number of sensors out there. A farmer now is running operational technology as opposed to your traditional tractor and plow. And there's data, there's critical data, and there's also data that if it was manipulated, it could really affect the outcomes of the farming operation. So really, I think for the farmer, the sophisticated Canadian farmer, you are partnering with the suppliers of agricultural goods and services. And you're looking at what we refer to as third-party risk, and how that could impact your organization, how that could impact your farm. What do you look for? You look for, I believe you look for value. You look for asking exactly the questions you're asking of your suppliers, and for large farmers, potentially partnering with others that are going to help them make those decisions, because highly, highly vulnerable from what we refer to as an operational technology perspective.
Thank you very much. And that takes us to the end of the panel and the end of our session. Again, apologies for the late start. This is our world at the moment. We're very grateful for your wisdom and your commitment of time to this committee. It's very important work. So on behalf of all of Parliament, thank you very much for your testimony and for being a part of this democratic process. Colleagues, it'll be a very quick turnaround to the next panel. I'm told by the clerk even less than 5 minutes. So I'll see you in very, very soon. Organize our rounds the same way we did in the first number of witnesses, a full round and then the first four of the second round. I'm very happy to call the meeting back to order, and in this second hour, we will hear from Dr. Frédéric Coppens, Professor, Polytechnique Montréal, Dr. Nora Coppens, Professor, Polytechnique Montréal, and from Dr. Jonathan Paquin, Full Professor, Department of Political Science, Université Laval. Up to 5 minutes of opening comments from all of our witnesses, and we can get started right away. So I will ask Dr. Coppens. Well, which one, you might ask? How about Frédéric Coppens to begin with a 5-minute opening statement whenever you're ready?
C'est Madame qui commence.
In fact, Ms. Coppens will begin. Good morning, everyone. I will be starting. We have prepared a joint statement with my colleague. Thank you for receiving us before the committee. I will begin with providing some background. We all know the background, an invasion by the Russian Federation of Ukraine, and the support provided by NATO and the West to Ukrainians to stave off the invasion. So now the question is, are we to fear reprisals in the form of cyber attacks? Is the war essentially going to move to cyberspace? Russia has shown its ability to conduct cyber warfare with extremely organized cyber attackers or hackers. For example, groups such as APT28, Fancy Bear attacked TV5 Monde. APT29, Cozy Bear, is well known for interfering in the 2016 U.S. elections. UN Unit 74455 attacked Black Energy and Indestroyer. And the Conti Group, which is known through the Ryuk virus, which is ransomware. Long before the outbreak of the military attack on Ukraine, there were already very high tensions between the U.S. and Russia. Following the SolarWinds attack, President Biden called President Putin a killer. He has since used other words to describe him. So cyber attacks from Russia are likely to multiply and intensify, particularly those that help Iran and they will be, and Russia, so they will be focusing on Ukraine's Western allies, including Canada. So which targets and which threats? The form the cyber war can take is very diverse. What's the most visible form of cyber warfare today is information warfare. It is to be expected that the information warfare will continue and that fake news will proliferate. Many experts agree that the effects of cyber attacks are limited for now. However, shortly after the start of the conflict in Ukraine, the Conti Group claimed a responsibility for the attack on the Alouette aluminium plant. Last week, there was an attack against Rideau Hall. That's a very strong symbolic impact. But we haven't yet been able to confirm whether Russia was involved in that. Why has Russia not yet launched a major cyber attack? That is a significant question, but though we don't have an answer, we do have two hypotheses. Like a conventional war, a cyber war needs preparation. And Russia perhaps has not yet properly prepared for a major cyber attack. Hypothesis 2 is the red line triggering a massive cyber attack, and this by either side could be seen as crossing the red line, and that would inevitably lead to an escalation of the conflict. Critical infrastructure is the priority. We always fear attacks through sabotage of critical infrastructure. Our geographical remoteness does not protect us. Some experts have compared cyber weapons to nuclear weapons in terms of their deterrent force, because cyber attacks can be compared to an atomic attack in some ways. There are two untruths that we can point out. First of all, that infrastructure not connected to the internet is protected from attack by what we call the air gap, and we know this is not true because Stuxnet was attacked. Secondly, a Die Hard 4 style liquidation scenario designed 10 seconds, please. All steps of a scenario of that kind are feasible.
Dr. Frédéric Coppens for up to 5 minutes of an opening statement. Sir, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. Hello.
Monsieur Frédéric. Désolé, j'étais mis.
I'm sorry, I was on mute. Yes, that's better. I was saying that a Die Hard 4 style liquidation scenario is unfortunately something that might happen. Attacks against road traffic, air traffic, telecommunication systems, media, energy distribution systems, financial systems, and the stock exchange. We have already had examples showing how possible these cyber attacks are. So it's just a matter of preparation and means. Isolated individuals would find it complicated to mount such attacks, but if they're mounted on a national scale, they're quite feasible. So what recommendations are we proposing? There are basic recommendations. The first one would be to stop using software from Russia, especially security software. For example, some countries have already recommended that users stop using Kaspersky antivirus software immediately. Second, we should make the assumption that cyber attacks can originate from anywhere, not just from Russia. For example, the Conti Group was headed by a 12-year-old girl who lived in Le Mans, France. we also have to raise the overall security level in Canada. This requires general mobilization of all resources to deal with cyber attacks. And there's an urgent need to federate and coordinate cybersecurity expertise at the industrial, academic, and government levels. We also suggest that the government take charge of the cybersecurity of critical infrastructure. This is what a number of countries have already done, for example, France with its military programming legislation. Our efforts at the Polytechnique focus on research and training. With regard to training, it's very important to establish a program at the undergraduate and master's level in cybersecurity. It would require a professional master's degree in cybersecurity. At the research level, we believe that there should be work on cyber weapons as a deterrent. This requires developing solutions to meet the following needs. Attribution, for example, that is the ability to trace an attack back to its actual source. This is not trivial because we need to be able to attribute problems to their source if we want to use cyber weapons properly. A lot of work today is focused on protection and detection, but large-scale cyber attacks will most likely require internal relays in the target infrastructure. So there is an internal threat. It is very important that we develop internal threat monitoring solutions to manage cases both of malice and of negligence, because negligence, in fact, is often the cause of an internal threat. We need metrics to measure the real impact of a cyber attack scenario. That's crucial to develop a cyber deterrence doctrine that respects the principles of proportionality in the response. Cyber resilience is crucial, the ability to resist. The Polytechnique has developed strong expertise in the cyber resilience of critical infrastructure, particularly in finance, supply chain, defense, maritime, and aeronautics. Aerospace. To meet these needs, we need to develop adapted solutions, particularly based on artificial intelligence. Thank you.
I'd now like to invite Dr. Paquin to give us up to 5 minutes of an opening comment, sir, whenever you're ready.
Ladies and gentlemen, honorable members, it is an honor and a privilege to testify before you here today. The fact suggests that Moscow is a threat to our country's security. Over the past 15 years, Russia has conducted cyber attacks against critical infrastructure in countries hostile to its interests over the past 15 years. Since Canada is perceived as very hostile to Moscow's interests, we are a prime target for the Kremlin. We know that the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, recently declared in the Italian media, and I quote, "The U.S. and particularly Canada have played a primary role, a principal role in the encouragement of radical neo-Nazi divisions in Ukraine," end quote. So that is the Russian perception of our role in the conflict. Moreover, Moscow funds information and disinformation, misuse and misinformation campaigns in the West. The goal is to disinform and to divide our fellow citizens and to sap and weaken our democratic institutions. These activities have been documented. Since the invasion of Ukraine began, Putin's regime has repeatedly threatened to use nuclear weapons, either tactical or strategic, because it believes that NATO is waging a proxy war against Russia. As a result, since February 24th, we have had to be very vigilant about threats the Kremlin represents to Canadian public safety and national security. We must be even more vigilant now that the West has escalated its objectives in the Ukrainian conflict and is openly seeking to weaken Russia's capabilities. And this more offensive stance is contributing to the escalation of tensions with Russia. And since Canada supports it, the Kremlin represents a growing threat to our security. I believe that the best security stance that Canada should have vis-à-vis Russia combines deterrence through reprisal, deterrence by punishment. That is made possible by Article 5 of the NATO statutes, combined with deterrence by denial. That means by cyber resilience, by becoming educated about disinformation, and through a renewed continent-wide defense system. I believe that the primary threat to Canada is cyber attacks on our critical infrastructure. The Canadian government must increase investment to strengthen the security of such infrastructures, and that will make us increasingly resilient against Russian attacks. The idea is to discourage the Kremlin from carrying out such attacks because it would know that they are unlikely to succeed. That is another example of deterrence by denial. As for information manipulation campaigns by Moscow, the impact is less immediate and more diffuse than the impact of cyber attacks. I believe that Canada is reasonably well equipped to deal with disinformation because it is not very vulnerable to them. Lastly, despite the worrying statements made by President Putin, Russia's use of weapons of mass destruction is less of a risk to Canada than our cyber attacks. Nonetheless, since the war in Ukraine is unpredictable, the Canadian government has a responsibility to invest more in modernizing NORAD's command and control system. We need an excellent surveillance system to detect Russian missiles early, particularly hypersonic missiles. The Minister of Defense has already made announcements about this, and that is good. We also need, in my view, to reconsider our participation in the North American Missile Defense Shield, since Washington is not required to defend Canada's territories from Russian missile attacks. I will stop there, and I will be happy to do my best in answering your questions.
Now we'll move to a full round of questions, and we will begin with the 6-minute slot from Mr. Lloyd. Sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for coming out today. My first question will be for Dr. Nora Cuppins. Something you said really piqued my interest. You said that the Russians had claimed a cyber attack on Rideau Hall, but that you can't confirm at this time whether or not they were actually behind the attack. Is it, do you believe that the Russians will sometimes claim responsibility for attacks that they didn't actually carry out in order to sow confusion in Canada?
Thank you for the question. Attribution is a significant problem because it is not easy to find the source of an attack. There are groups of attackers which, even if they are identified, as some are, rarely claim credit for the attack. So when they do claim credit, that means they are trying to use provocation. They want a reaction. The attack on Rideau Hall is not something that they might claim. They leave space there for people to suppose where it might have come from. And
what I'm trying to confirm is, do you think sometimes that the Russians, in order to create disinformation, create fear and confusion, will sometimes claim responsibility for attacks even if they weren't involved in the attack? Is that a form of disinformation that we need to watch out for? Like, do we just take it at face value when they say that they've done an attack, or is it still important to do an attribution to confirm whether or not they are indeed the source of the attack?
Well, they do hide. And we see that the same thing happens with terrorist attacks. Terrorist groups do that. As soon as there is an attack, they can claim credit for it, regardless of who actually perpetrated the attack. So yes, they might claim credit for an attack to make people believe that they are responsible for an attack, to create fear, and show that if A does something, then they, B, can retaliate very strongly. So they might be taking credit. Now, the attack on Rita Hall, even if the Russians aren't behind it, does sow fear because it creates unpredictability and concern.
Thank you for that. Dr. Frederick Coppens, one of the things that seems to be a tactical or a strategic strength in Western democracies is a strong ecosystem in the information technology sector, which I would hope would carry over into both cyber offensive capabilities and cyber defensive capabilities. What are some recommendations that you would make so that Canada can maintain and build upon its strategic strengths in these areas? Is it more investment in education in terms of developing engineers who are capable of building this infrastructure? Is it a tax credit to encourage the private sector to invest in cybersecurity capabilities in Canada? What are your recommendations on what the government can do to facilitate a strong private-public sector response and an ecosystem for cybersecurity?
The first dimension is training. We need to train more engineers who are experts in cybersecurity to monitor, detect. The witness has raised his microphone to the top of his head and is very difficult to hear. We need resilience, solutions to detect internal threats.
Closer to your mouth, the interpreters are, yes, that's probably better.
Comme ça, c'est mieux?
I had been asked to raise it. So I was saying for the defensive aspects, that is what we're working on to strengthen cyber resilience, detection of external and internal threats. Now,
maybe could you please follow up with a written submission with your recommendations? I'd appreciate that. My final question is, there was a pipeline outage in the United States in the past couple of years. I believe it was the Continental Pipeline, and it completely blew up the energy infrastructure, and gas prices were going through the roof. We're in a time of high inflation right now. Oil supplies, energy supplies are very tight. What can the government do to strengthen our energy transportation infrastructure to protect it from a similar attack?
Je ne sais pas qui s'adresse la question.
I don't know who that question was to.
Dr. Coppens, and you unfortunately have only 10 seconds to answer.
Alors,
for transport, it's crucial to work on the supply chain requiring multimodal transport. Vulnerabilities are generally on the borders of modes, for example, when you go from sea to rail or rail to road. The transitions in the chains are points of maximum vulnerability.
Mr. McKinnon, over to you now for a 6-minute round, sir, whenever you're ready.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Chair. I'm going to start with Dr. Péquin. You made a remark about NATO in Article 5 that I'd like you to clarify. It seems to me, and perhaps I heard you incorrectly, but you said that Article 5 could be used to justify a response to an attack on us. My understanding of Article 5 is not that it would justify a response by us for an attack on us, but it would require us to respond to an attack on one of the other NATO members. So are you suggesting that by a cyber attack on one of our NATO allies, we would be justified in, we would be required to respond via Article 5?
Alors, c'est une question qui est très importante.
That's a very important question. Increasingly within NATO, people are concerned about the consequences of cyber attacks because the impacts can be considerable. So NATO is preparing for massive attacks and is discussing whether a massive attack against a country's critical infrastructure would be considered in an attack against the country. The Article 5 does not necessarily state that all other countries should be engaged in a collective defense. It states that each member has a responsibility to take means it considers appropriate to help the state that has been a victim of attack. Now, the problem with cyber attacks and NATO, and I'll come back to what my colleagues Frederick and Nora were saying, is attribution. We have to be able to show beyond any doubt that a given attack, for example, a cyber attack on Canada, was indeed perpetrated by the Kremlin, can be attributed to the Kremlin and not hackers that are acting independently, but may be located in Russia. We have to prove that it is a Kremlin-led attack, and that's not easy. So we find Article 5, therefore, less relevant in connection with cyber attacks.
Okay, thank you, Doctor. I'm going to switch now to Dr. Nora Cuppins. Some of our previous witnesses have identified that one of our problems in Canada is a lack of a central agency to coordinate and manage across our society possible attacks. CSE has a very narrow role in that respect. I'm wondering if that's a role that CSE should be undertaking, or whether you have any comments on the fundamental premise.
Merci pour la question.
Thank you for the question. I come from Europe, and it's true that in Europe, in France, we have a National Information System Security Agency, which serves both as an observation platform and a source of government authority and coordination. So it would be useful to have an institution of that kind which would operationalize the protection of our systems and infrastructure. We have a lot of rules. We have statutes on how to protect ourselves and how to respond, but there are few obligations to apply those rules for a given region. The presence of a region, of an institute rather, that would both observe and implement, and that would ensure that the rules are in fact properly applied, would seem to me to be crucial if we are to continue along the right path. It is difficult, you might say, for small and medium-sized businesses to apply all the rules, but an institute or institution of this kind could be of help. We talked about the supply chain and the fact that attacks are not full-on against a particular entity, but often come through third parties, for example, attacks against supply chains, which are less secure.
You mentioned, of course, small enterprises and so forth. So the dairy farmer or the garage down the street, they're connected to the internet, and they're possibly either vulnerable themselves or perhaps a gateway to someone else's vulnerability. So how, and this kind of protection, the detection of an attack, is a very specialized and arcane skill set. So how are those kinds of companies, those kind of organizations, going to protect themselves and therefore the network from attack?
Je peux répondre de deux façons.
I can answer that question in two ways. The first approach is the classical one. To protect information-based systems, and secondly, to use outside entities like experts to protect.
We now turn to you for a 6-minute block. The floor is yours.
Merci.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for accepting our invitation to appear today. I apologize for my hoarse voice. Mr. Pécan, seems another life when you were my professor at Laval University, and I hope that your expert knowledge will be of benefit to the committee. I'll begin with you. At the beginning of the conflict in Ukraine, you stated that as of the Second World War, the world had sought to avoid a conflict between two nuclear superpowers, and that was why Western authorities did not wish to go beyond economic sanctions so that, in fact, things wouldn't escalate beyond where they are now. But how could Russia respond to these economic sanctions, and how should Canada prepare itself? Is it sufficiently prepared to resist attack? Thank you. It is a real pleasure to see you again in a different context. In answer to your question, it's very important for Canada to do everything in its power to make sure that the conflict in Ukraine remains limited and remains within the boundaries, the borders of Ukraine. As long as we focus on economic sanctions and bear in mind that our goal is to help Ukrainians to free their territory in compliance with international law and in compliance with liberal values, that should be sufficient. That should prevent escalation. But what we're seeing is the appearance of a new Western strategy towards Ukraine. The goal is no longer just to help Ukrainians defend themselves, it is also to weaken Russia. The Minister of Finance and Deputy Prime Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, said in her speech when she presented the federal budget on April 7th that democracies, including Canada, would be free only when the Russian tyrant is defeated. That sort of rhetoric, though it could be considered legitimate, does send the message that we are not simply seeking to help Ukraine liberate itself, but our stance has become more offensive, and we have the objective of weakening Russia. That might lead Russia to counterattack. Russia feels humiliated. Certainly President Putin feels humiliated. If because of actions by Canada and Ukraine, by delivering heavy weapons, if Russia were to lose the war, or if Russia were not to be in a position to win the war in the eastern and southern part of Ukraine, it is very likely that Russia will not fail to seek reprisals. We believe that cyber attacks, not on small and medium-sized businesses that are not incorporated into major value chains, but attacks on major infrastructure are a distinct possibility. And that is why we believe that the authorities have to increase investment in a way that will secure our digital space. It will also have to increase coordination with the provinces and territories, as well as our major partners like the US and the UK. Thank you. You touched on an important point in your opening statement. You spoke about Canada's role in the conflict and the perception of Canada's role in the conflict. We know that China and India have not condemned the invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So what role might that Russian perception of Canada have on other powers? How can that perception of Canada by Russia lead to destabilization? Because we are not protected from cyber attacks. I believe that before February 24th, many observers were wondering whether Western states, and that included Canada, were in fact ready to go far enough to defend their values. Many did not think so. Vladimir Putin certainly did not seem to think so. Xi Jinping in Beijing did not think so. But this has shown that Canada, Western allies, NATO in particular, are in a position to ramp up their cooperation and capable of acting in concert when needed. And that is a real turning point, because the message we're sending to countries like China, because there's Taiwan, of course, is that we are ready to do what's necessary. If necessary, we're ready to wage war by proxy in order to defend our allies and partners, our democratic allies and partners. That is a clear message by Canada. We have in the past had a somewhat Manichaean approach. We've seen things in terms of black and white. We've seen some democracies we considered good and some we considered not good. Canada's position now is very clear. It has not always been clear in the past. Canada used to have some difficulty in presenting a clear position, but now, as it were, we've made our bed and we will have to lie in it.
The last slice of this round goes to you. You have 6 minutes, sir, whenever you're ready.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses for helping guide our committee through this study. Dr. Nora Coppens, I would like to start with you. In your opening remarks, you were talking about the information war that exists and Russia's responsibility in that. You know, here in Canada, during the month of February, we noticed a switch at the end of that month from a lot of groups that were involved in anti-vaccine protests. Suddenly, with the war beginning in Ukraine, there was a noticeable shift to a pro-Russian stance. They started echoing Russian propaganda, really trying to promote that. It was almost overnight from the beginning of the war in Ukraine. I guess what I'd like to ask you, Dr. Nora Coppens, is what can we learn from that? I guess it speaks to the level of Russian involvement in developing that misinformation, spreading disinformation in Canada, which I think many of us rightly perceive as a threat to our democracy if we can't even agree on a common set of facts. And moreover, what would you recommend that the federal government, like what programs and policies can the federal government effectively enact to combat that when we have a state actor who is very hostile to Canada's interests, meddling in our internal affairs and exploiting those divisions in our democracy?
Merci.
Thank you for the question. We always come back to the same problem: attribution. In our cybersecurity work, we often look at correlations to try to detect intrusions and attacks, determine their targets, and determine their goal. The reasoning remains the same. It starts in cyberspace and moves into the everyday space in the way it's manifested. So the motives, it's difficult to see whether the goal of an attack is necessarily linked to the Kremlin. There are also isolated initiatives, people who take the initiative. And they could be Russian, but it would still be a personal initiative, a personal hack. So it's very difficult at any point to determine with any confirmation whether it is the Kremlin at the root of any given attack. And, for example, the invasion and some things that happened around it, as well as attacks in Ukraine, attacks on certain energy sources. It's difficult to pinpoint them with any particular accuracy. So we are working on attribution. We haven't yet found a perfect answer how to trace back a hack to its source, an attack to its source.
But I've only got 2 minutes left, and I want to get to Dr. Thank you. I want to get to Dr. Frederick Cuppins. Sir, you mentioned France's cybersecurity law. I think you're referencing the Critical Infrastructure Information Protection, and France has identified in 12 sectors. They include food, health, water, telecom and broadcasting, space and research, industry, energy, transport, finance, civilian administration, military activities, and justice. And you use that as an example. You know, Canada needs to take the lead at the federal level on establishing cybersecurity. What kind of a recommendation would you, sir, like to see this committee make to the federal government? Would you like to see us take the France model and introduce federal legislation here to really have that basic level of requirement across those sectors? If you could elaborate on that, that would be helpful, sir.
I don't have an answer to the last part of your question. However, there are some very useful aspects to what we suggest for military programming. In France, a company that deals with a critical sector, once it is declared as essential, has a number of obligations it needs to apply in order to be in compliance with the critical infrastructure legislation. This does touch larger enterprises, but it also touches smaller businesses as soon as that small business deals with a critical sector. Every sector is the responsibility of a given department, and it is that department's responsibility to ensure that all companies covered by it are compliant.
Within 3 or 4 minutes of the end of our time, we don't have time to go into another round. Some of us have a hard stop within 2 minutes from now. So I would like to thank the witnesses and to apologize for the rushed nature of the discussion. It's because of a vote that was required at the beginning of this session. I apologize for that. And on behalf of all members of the committee, I want to thank those who have come today for your experience, your expertise, your wisdom, shedding light on such an important part of Canadian public policy. So thank you for all of your contributions. Colleagues, we'll see you on Thursday. This meeting is adjourned.